Welcome to Share Control, your workspace in the cloud. In this video, we'll go through the main features of Share Control contract and IFRS 16. The main focus will be on IFRS 16, but please note that all types of contracts can be registered in the system. To register contracts other than IFRS 16 lease contracts, you need to create separate libraries for those contracts. Enter the key data and the date when the contract will be renewed and upload the contract. If you have subscribed to the Pro version, all contracts will be available in the Power BI tool. Please see our separate video about the Pro version. We will start with the registration of a new contract. First in draft, then as a final contract where the changes must be registered using the change log. All calculations are done in the Excel VBA calculation file, where we will walk you through all the main features. You'll find all disclosures and details in the calculation file. Be aware that all new contracts and all changes need to be registered in SharePoint. The next session is about foreign exchange, both as a translation of foreign entities and translation of contracts in a different currency than the reporting currency. The last session is about changes to existing contracts using the change log. The main feature of the new version is that registration of periods is changed. There are now an unlimited number of periods. This makes it much easier to register changes in payments and fixed payments in complex contracts. You can add options easily and turn on or off whether they should be included. Please be aware of the language in the standard when you include option periods. The option needs to be reasonably certain to be exercised. Another improvement to cash flow registration is that it's now possible to further specify your fixed annual adjustments. We have added fields for setting the frequency, which no longer are required to be yearly, and one can add an end date of the adjustments as well as register a fixed amount that is exempt from the adjustments. It's now possible to specify the depreciation dates separate from the dates of the lease payment. This can be useful for stopping depreciation in a period and start again for contracts that are impaired or set depreciation period differently under a construction period. Please note that for most lease contracts, the depreciation will be equal to the lease term. So do not use this functionality unless your contract falls under the exceptions to IFRS 16. Sublease. You can now enter sublease arrangements if these agreements fulfill the offset requirements in IFRS 16. This is a functionality that is available in the Pro version. You identify the sublease contract for each lease contract. The ROU asset will be eliminated and replaced with a lease receivable, and loss of the lease contract and gain on the sublease will be shown separately and should be netted. The loss of the lease contract must be calculated manually by the user because it's almost impossible to create a generic solution that satisfies every lease. Calculation file. In the function lookup periods, you decide the periods. This is also used to create a counting voucher for the selected period for those who have this function. Set January 2019 to January 2019 to get figures for January 2019. Set January to March for figures for the first quarter and use January to December to get figures for the whole year. Search filter gives the opportunity to set up search filters. Here is the company selected. Add new filter like this. Delete filter by deleting the row. You can expand or reduce the number of columns to be viewed. Add extra columns by clicking the first free column in the top row and selecting from the options that appear. Columns are deleted by deleting the selection. Settings menu. In the calculation template, you'll now find a new settings menu. We will go through the different options. Hide warnings to hide the warning summary. This is useful if you have checked all warnings and have concluded that the leases are registered correctly. Hide errors for non-IFRS 16 leases, like short-term leases or low-value assets that have been included in the system. Currency settings. If you want the system to automatically calculate income statement captions and changes to average exchange instead of closing rate, turn off using closing rate only. It's also possible to specify your currency source. We currently only have 2 built-in choices, but if you're interested in adding your own currency source, then contact us and we'll see whether it's possible or not. Pro forma calculation. Turn on this feature to get pro forma figures in a period before the acquisition date of leases acquired through a business combination. Short-term liability. We support 2 separate definitions for the short-term liability. Our standard definition is to use the installments of the next 12 months, while the alternate definition instead uses the discounted value of the new 12 months payments. The menu sheet has always been the easiest way for the user to create their own reports. There have always been over 100 different options, but it has not been apparent what they are. We have therefore added a separate menu that appears when a header cell is selected and the user presses Control Space. This menu is both searchable and includes information on what the results represents. Therefore, you can also use this to check what numbers a header represents by searching for it in this menu. The calculation model now has better integration with non-standard share control metadata, and it's possible to both look these up on the menu sheet as well as use them as filters. Archive button. Click this function to delete the link to SharePoint to save the version you have used for a financial close. This means that the file will not be updated with changes recorded afterwards in SharePoint. Reconciliation. In this tab, there's an overview of changes in leasing contracts during the period as a result of changes in lease liability and the right-of-use asset. Use lookup period function to select period for reconciliation. Go directly from here to the underlying contract. If you want to verify the changes on a contract, you can click on the amount in the Change column contract and review the cash flow before and after the change. Export. We can set up an export file for accounting system for a consolidation system. This is an add-on feature that makes accounting safer and faster. If you have subscribed for this additional function, the period is used to enter the selected period, and by pressing Export, the custom import file comes in a separate tab. When using this function, you don't have to manually set up book entries. Budget and Forecast. In this tab, future installments, interest, and depreciation are disclosed for future periods with multiple periodization options. Future signed contracts are included, and you can also register planned contracts in Share Control and have them included. In the 2020 version, we have improved the functionality for foreign exchange. We will now present the 2 new features. 1. Translation of foreign operations. You can now choose between Present All Income Statement Caption to Closing Rate or to the average rate for the period. Go to Settings to make your choice. If you use average rate, income statement elements such as interest and depreciation will be recognized to the average rate for the actual month, and balance sheet will be recognized to the exchange rate at the beginning of the period and recalculated to the exchange rate at the end of the period. For changes to the average exchange rate for the month, the change occur is used. If you use closing rate, all elements will be recognized to the closing rate. Foreign exchange translation differences will be disclosed for each individual contract under reconciliation and in the footnote disclosure. 2. Reporting foreign currency transactions in the functional currency. If you have a lease contract in a different currency than your reporting currency, the system can now register the right-of-use asset in the functional currency at the exchange rate at the date you entered the contract. Answer yes to the question, is the lease currency different from the entity's functional currency? Choose the functional currency of the entity and enter the exchange rate to be used for translating from the contract currency to the functional currency. When you change an existing contract using the log change functionality, change the exchange rate under currency to enter the correct exchange rate at the date of the change. In the calculation file, you will now see the currency for the liability, which is the same as the contract currency and the functional currency for the right-of-use asset. In this session, we'll go through the change log. We'll begin with index regulations that you need to do on a regular basis, and then go through other changes, like option extension, termination of a contract before the end of the contract term, and accounting for the COVID-19 amendment to IFRS 16. Adjust CPI. Index regulation notification appears on the front page, and you can go directly from there to the contract to be adjusted. Press the Index Regulations and the menu. Enter new minimum lease payment based on the adjusted lease payment invoice from the lessor, and modify the date for the next index adjustment if the suggested date is not correct. Press Save when you're finished. When the calculation is updated, this appears as follows. If you have several contracts that need to be regulated at the same time, we do recommend using the function in the menu. Make your choices using the filters and choose the libraries for the contracts you need to update. Choose the adjustment period and the contracts for adjustment appears below the table. For the index regulation that will be at the end of 2019 or at the beginning of 2020, choose the filter to include January 2020. Please note that the contracts have to be registered as based on an index or rate in SharePoint in order to be included in the overview. The next step is to set the date that the adjustment is effective, like January 1st, 2020. The contract that can be adjusted appears with an empty box. If there's an X behind the contract, you are outside the adjustment period. Mark the contracts you want to adjust on the chosen date. Enter the adjustment in percentage and the amounts are automatically calculated. You can now manually adjust the suggested figures for each individual contract. Set the next date for index adjustment that will be uploaded in SharePoint, or use the suggested date. Click Save to start the calculation. After you have saved, remember to update the calculation. Lease modification or reassessment of a lease. Changes as lease modification, lease reassessment as exercise of an option to extend the lease, change in the lease term, and change in discount rate and termination are accessed here. You start by recording the date the change is effective. An example: if you have entered into an agreement for an extension of a lease agreement based on an option to extend, then the date for the decision on the extension will be the date on which the change is registered. If there are several events with different dates that shall be registered, then this must be repeated for each change. The changes must be made in chronological order. This is controlled by the data selector, which will prevent you from returning to a date before the last change. This means, for example, that if you want to enter an extension of a contract before you make a CPI regulation, then the extension must be entered before the CPI regulation is entered. In case of an error, you can go back to the previous version using the changelog. We recommend using the comment headline for changes so that you can review changes that have been made. If there are several changes that take place on the same date, the changes can be registered simultaneously. It's important that the date of change is correct and is consistent with the month the change should be recorded. Discount rate. Changes in the discount rate are made here. A change in the discount rate by, for example, based on an extension of the contract, or based on that the contract is regulated based on change in the discount rate, is made here. The change is calculated from the time that is registered for the change. Be aware that the discount rate set on January 1st, 2019 is normally not changed without the change in the lease terms. Lease modifications. It's important to distinguish between a reassessment of an existing lease contract and a lease modification. Reassessments relate to change in estimates used in the lease accounting. Modification is a change in the scope of a lease, or in consideration for a lease that was not part of its original terms and conditions. In case there's a change in the rental amount, then the function periods can be used. And here, changes to the rental amount are recorded from the change date registered. Changes can only be made for future periods. All changes will then be discounted to the registered date of the change. Changes to leases contract may be complicated, and we refer to the auditor's publications. There's more detailed information in our user guide on how complex changes are recorded, and we can of course assist in complex situations. There's also the possibility of copying the lease to a test page and evaluate the outcome before you make the changes on the actual lease. Termination. In share control, there are two options to terminate a contract. Situation A, a termination that is an option in the original contract. In this case, the reduction in the cash flow reduces the future depreciations and do not result in a gain or loss on termination, except in those cases where the termination has an immediate effect. In this case, answer no to the question, is the change a lease modification? Situation B. You agree to terminate an existing agreement and enter a new agreement with the same landlord. The termination of the existing contract was not part of its original terms. In this situation, the termination of the existing contract is a lease modification, and the answer should be yes. Enter the date the termination is effective to stop the cash flow at this date. Future depreciations are not changed and a gain and loss is recognized. The new contract is entered from the commencement date. Change of option for extension. You can go directly from the front page to the current contract if you have registered the date for the option to extend. Choose extension options and make the changes, such as exercising an option that has not previously been included in the calculation. Keep in mind that the date you have registered is the time the change is recorded and the time you discount the changes in future payments and adjust the lease liability and the corresponding right-of-use asset. Purchase options. If you have a right to purchase the underlying assets, then this is registered here. By turning on a purchase option, the lease liability and the right-of-use asset increase with the discounted value of the payment for the right-of-use asset at the end of the lease contract. The residual value should be set to the same value, so that the right-of-use asset is then depreciated to the residual value. Purchase option date is the date on which the lease payment is discounted to and the period the change is accounted for. For those who have negotiated change in lease payment as a result of COVID-19 concessions, use the period function in the change log and register the change's fixed payments for the periods and write COVID-19 in the change comment. We do recommend copying the first period and make changes so the information about the historic payments are readily available. This is how it's shown in the demo. Please also see our separate guidance on IFRS 16 and COVID-19 for a detailed description. We have now shown some of the functionality in an upgraded version of Share Control IFRS 16. More information and guidance can be found in the operating instructions found on our website. Share Control is a company with experienced accountants and IT experts who are here to help you. Visit us on our website.